I appreciate the kind introduction. I am surprised it was as nice as it was. And what Dub went over in his lesson briefly, we will deal with many of those points in this lesson as well. As we stated last night, many of these lessons will overlap in many regards. In fact, one person asked me as at the end of one period and the beginning of another period, isn't that going to overlap? And I said, yeah, it is. You can't help but. So these do overlap by the very nature of them. But as you look at dispensation, it comes from the basic word is dispense. And it is a dispensing thus of something. It is basically in relationship to time as to how God saw fit to divide his portion of that divine economy known as time. There are those three divisions or dispensations, those three periods, the patriarchal, the Mosaic, and one of my pet peeves is when people say Mosaical. IC means relating to or of, and AL means pertaining to. So there's no reason for the AL at the end of Mosaic. It's the Mosaic period, and then the Christian dispensation. And in each of these, God dispensed his law to man. Our study this morning with this lesson will deal with that first period, the patriarchal dispensation. Patriarchal is made up of three parts: patri, which means father; arche, which means rule; and then the suffix al, which means pertaining to. Thus, patriarchal period is that period of time pertaining to father rule. God was, in this period, dealing directly with the head of the household instead of working through prophets and priests, as we would see during that Mosaic period of time. The principle is stated for us in Genesis 3 and verse 16, when God says to Eve, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." He is stating in that very basic principle, and this is not limited to patriarchal dispensation, but it does deal with that aspect of father rule, which is the patriarchal dispensation. And in that period of time, the father thus was acting as the prophet of God in relationship to his family. Prophet is one who speaks forth for God, specifically as it relates to spiritual matters. And we would see that as God states about Abraham, that I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him. Well, that aspect of commanding his children and his household after them is Abraham being that spokesman for God to his family and commanding his children and his household, giving them what God has stated. But the father would also serve as the priest to God on the behalf of the family. We would see that in Job, the first chapter, and specifically the first couple of verses, and then again in verse 5, in which Job would offer burnt offerings for each of his children. He was in that acting as a priest to God on behalf of his children. And thus we see both aspects in relationship to God's dealings with the families, as that head of the family would be the spokesman for God to his family, and then act on behalf of his family to God as being a priest. But in this period, God is revealed not only as a God of, and as some have put it, a tribal deity, and we might, in some regards, cringe at that phraseology, but it does express the idea that he is not simply the God of a tribe like Abraham and his children and his house, but that he is also the God of the nations. We see this, and Abraham recognizes it in Genesis the 18th chapter and verse 25. When Abram recognizes God's right to be the judge of all the world. When he asks the question, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And thus he is not just a God of this particular family or another particular family, but he is truly the God of the world, the earth. In Exodus, the 2nd chapter, when Moses flees Egypt, he goes to the land of Midian, and he meets there Jethro. And Jethro was serving as the priest of Midian. Exodus 2 and verse 16. Later on in Exodus the 18th chapter, after Moses brings the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage, Jethro again meets Moses and gives him advice. But Jethro, on this occasion, or as his work was relating to being a priest for the nation of the Midianites to God. Now, we recognize we probably would not ever know about Jethro except by his association with Moses. But God was, we can see in this, dealing with other people and nations, even though we might not have a record of such. He was still dealing with those people and those nations. And so while during Patriarchy it's often described as a family-type religion, and Judaism being described as a national religion, and then Christianity being a universal religion. And while during Patriarchy, yes, there was that family-type religion, and primarily it dealt with that, but yet we see God dealing with nations as well. And we see him on thus a universal basis. And so all three of those aspects are, to a certain extent, incorporated into Patriarchy. But during Patriarchy, we see that there is a law. God gave certain commands or laws during this dispensation of time. During the Mosaic period and the Christian period, those laws were written down for us. During this period of time, they were primarily oral in nature. In Genesis, the 1st chapter, and in the 3rd chapter, God has given to Adam and Eve certain commands. They were to be fruitful and fill the earth. They were to have dominion over all living things. And they were not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, those are commands, both positive and negative commands, in relationship to their relationship to God. When we see Cain and Abel, Cain brought an offering to God, which again implies to us that there is an instruction given by God to Cain and Abel in relationship to making an offering. And God accepted, of course, Abel's. He rejected Cain's. Thus, there had to be some instruction, thus a law, given to them in that regard of making an offering. These instructions would have been oral and not written down for us, though. But in both of these, we also see that there is punishment for violating that law. Adam and Eve violated God's law when God had stated, do not eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they ate of that tree. They were then cast out of the garden. They were separated from God. Genesis 3:23 and 24. With Cain, God refused to accept Cain's offering. And Genesis 4 and verse 7 tells him that if you do well, it will be accepted. Otherwise, sin lieth at the door. There's the first introduction and the first time we have the word sin being used in relationship to Cain's offering. And since sin is transgression of the law, and that editor sure did a rotten job because he has the wrong verse there, and he didn't catch it. I'll blame it all on the editors. It's his fault, not mine, but I think it has Genesis or 1 John 4 and verse 7, which talks about the love of God. It should have been 1 John 3 and verse 4. So you can make that correction in your book, and hopefully the editor will do better next time. Thank you. But since it is a transgression of law, they transgressed law in order to commit sin. And since God said it was sin, thus we know that there is a law in relationship to the offerings that were to be made to God. And we also would tie in Romans 4 and verse 15, that where there is no law, or where no law is, there is no transgression. And since Cain violated God's law, there had to be a law. After the murdering of Abel by Cain, again we see punishment coming upon Cain because of that sin, because he had transgressed God's law. And yes, that dealt with a moral aspect in which he was responsible before God. And we see that after the flood, for example, that same principle is seen in Genesis 9 and verse 6. We see it continued in the Mosaic period. And we also see it incorporated into the Christian age, where murder, the taking of one's life, is wrong. It is sin. It is a transgression of God, of God's law. And thus we start seeing the beginning of various laws that will be incorporated into every dispensation or every system, and it begins at Patriarchal. Why are they incorporated into every system? Because they come or they flow from the very nature of God Himself. But Moses records primarily God's dealings with then Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the patriarchs. And to a great extent, he dismisses his dealings or the dealings with others as far as the written record is concerned. But even while dealing specifically with those patriarchs, we have the aspect of other nations. We come across, for example, Melchizedek, Genesis the 14th chapter. And it says that he was the king of Salem. The word Salem means peace. And he was also the priest of God. And thus, God has not totally forgotten these other peoples and other nations even though he is dealing specifically with the patriarchs. And again, we know of God's dealings with Melchizedek and those people primarily based upon his association or what took place with Abraham. Otherwise, again, we would not know of Melchizedek and that situation, and it would not have been used by the Hebrew writer in Hebrews, the 7th chapter. But God has not forgotten those people, even though he's dealing primarily, as far as the written record, with these patriarchs. God promises the land of Palestine to Abraham's descendants, that after the 4th generation they would come up. Why the delay? Because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full, Genesis 15 and verse 16. Iniquity is another way of stating sin. And thus, here's the Amorite people who were guilty of sin, and thus they had been given a law by God which they had violated and which they would continue to violate until God determined to bring judgment upon them as a people and destroy them and take them out of that land. And actually, the children of Israel were to put all of them to death for the violation of God's law. We see God's attitude towards sodomy in the fact that God is going to destroy Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain. The reason? Because their sin is very grievous. Genesis 18 and verse 20. God revealed from the beginning what his desire was in relationship to the nature of men and women. And he shows that homosexuality is sinful, no matter what our courts might say, and no matter what the emphasis that our society is placing upon making it simply an alternate lifestyle or a gay lifestyle, which it is not, never has been, and never will be. It is sin. It is wickedness. It is a very grievous sin because it is a changing of that natural order that God created. But we also see that God views it the same way in the Mosaic dispensation, Leviticus the 18th chapter and verse 22 and Leviticus 20 and verse 13. We also see during the Christian dispensation the same principles being set forth in Romans the 1st chapter. And so again, here's a nation, here's a people, Sodom, Gomorrah, the cities of the plain, who violated God's law, but they had that law from God. Abraham was sojourning in Gerar, and Abraham lied to King Abimelech about his wife, Sarah. And God appears to Abimelech in a dream and says, "You're a dead man." Talk about a dead man walking. That's Abimelech. But Abimelech says, "I've done this in the innocency of my heart and hands." And so in Genesis 20 and verse 6, God says, "I also withheld thee from sinning against me." Again, sin, transgression of the law. Abimelech then relayed God's message to his people, acting as the prophet of God in relationship to Abraham and Sarah. And other nations, people were dealt with by God. These are just touching the hem of the garment. But we again primarily know of those nations because of their dealings with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and those patriarchs. But God was still giving to those nations and those people a law to which they were subject. Then we also need to deal with the time frame of patriarchal dispensation, and again, Dub dealt with this in a brief way. But it begins at creation. thus with Adam and Eve, and that's basically agreed by everyone. But when does it end? Many do teach that the Patriarchal dispensation ended with the giving of the Mosaic Law. Prior to the Mosaic Law, all men were subject to Patriarchal law. But the Mosaic Law was given only to the Israelites. Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 3, and other passages. And thus, Ussher, in his work on chronology, and while we know that there are certain dates that he has given that have been shown to be outdated, basically his is still the accepted or the recognized standard. And so we use Ussher's dates through this, and he gave the creation at 404 BC. He gave the giving of the law at 1491 BC. And thus we generally round it off to 2,500 years of that time frame between the creation and the giving of the law of Moses. But after the giving of the law of Moses only to the Israelites, what about all the other nations? What about the Gentile world? Well, either they had no law, and thus there was no sin by any of the Gentiles during that period, or else God had a law for them. They did sin, therefore there was a law, and that law to which they were thus continued to be subject was the Patriarchal law. Look at the Gentiles under Patriarchy. Jethro, we mentioned just a moment ago, Moses' father-in-law. He was a priest of Midian, Exodus 18 and verse 1. Should we assume that he, being a priest of Midian, coming out to Moses, giving Moses advice, and then going back to his people, that when God then, at that time, gave the Mosaic law to Israel, that Jethro's priesthood ended? By what reason would we think such? Instead, God continued to deal with those Midianites in the same way that he had done previously. And he had continued giving them a law. And Jethro remained a priest based upon patriarchal dispensation and law, and the Midianites remained under that patriarchal law. In Numbers, the 22nd chapter, during the period of the wilderness wanderings, thus the Mosaic law is already in existence. Balak, the Moabite king, was afraid of the Israelites. And so he sent men to call to Balaam to curse the Israelites. Balaam is a prophet of God, but he was not with the Israelites. He wasn't traveling with them. He wasn't living with them. He was separate from them. And what Balaam initially states that he can only say what God tells him to say. That's a prophet of God. He did not remain faithful to that statement, and thus he transgressed, but he would have been a prophet of God based upon patriarchal law and not Mosaic law. Elijah the Tishbite informed Ahab there's not going to be any rain. 1 Kings 17, verse 1. God instructs Elijah to go to the brook of Cherith, and God would feed him. But after a period of time, that brook dried up. He then tells Elijah to go to Zarepta, a city on the coast of Phoenicia, under the control of kings of Sidon at the time. And in 1 Kings 17 and verse 9, it says that I have commanded a widow there to sustain thee. God has commanded, what is that? That's a law. a widow of Zarepta to sustain you. The widow apparently was not an Israelite, but she received a message from God and obeyed that command that God had given to her. God was continuing to work with people and nations during that period of time. Jonah sent to Nineveh with a message, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown." The men of Nineveh repented, Jonah 3 and verse 10. The men of Nineveh had sinned, thus, and again, the men of Nineveh were not Israelites, thus there was a law to which they were subject. It's not the Mosaic law, it's the Patriarchal law. The men of Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah. Repentance is effected based upon law. You cannot repent if there is no law to which to come to and to change from that evil way to doing what is right. There's no way to do that unless there is a law that is the basis of that repentance. And thus, here again, they were not subject to Mosaic law. What law were they subject to? The only other option is the Patriarchal law. There's numerous examples that could be given. Daniel is a great example. Just read the entire book. You have the example of here's foreign nations that God is dealing with. Herod and Herodias, who were not Israelites, they were Idumean. Herod was, and yet he sinned in taking his brother Philip's wife. The statements of blessings are condemnation upon other nations. Righteousness exalteth a nation. Is that only the Israelites? Or is that all nations? Any nation? Well, of course, it's any nation. Sin is a reproach to not just the Israelites, but any people. Proverbs 14 and verse 34. Thus, here's righteousness and sin that is effected upon law. For the Israelites, it would have been the Mosaic law during that period, but during that same time in which Solomon wrote that, it would have been for the Gentiles the law of Patriarchal. And thus, when does that period end? Well, for the Jews, it ended when God gave them the law of Moses. That would have been at that time that we mentioned just a moment ago. For the Gentiles, though, it was at the cross of Christ, just like the Mosaic law. Both laws were nailed to the cross. However, the effect of what Jesus did on the cross was not seen till later. For the Jews, the law of Moses was nailed to the cross, yet what law were they subject to during that 50-day period between the cross and Pentecost? Well, they were still subject to the Mosaic law. What about the Gentiles? They were still subject to patriarchal law from that time of the cross, even though it was nailed to the cross, till the time of Cornelius. And we dealt more with that in the book, but God gives a progression of an order of the way in which the gospel is to be taken into the world. It was to begin at Jerusalem, but the very nature of a beginning means that there has to be a continuation. Beginning at Jerusalem for the Jews, but not the Gentile world. When was the Gentile world coming under that gospel system? When God determined it. And he determined that time when he sent that message to Cornelius to send for Peter. And he gives Peter a vision. And Peter learns that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth God and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. And thus, They were not to preach. They were not to apply that gospel message until God determined the time for them to apply it to the Gentile world. And that took place with Cornelius. And thus, that patriarchal dispensation for the Gentile world started at the creation and continued till the death of Christ, but its effects continued on till Cornelius in Acts the 10th chapter. Then very briefly, because I know someone's going to rudely come up here and interrupt my time, patriarchal's wages. And I put it that way because the wages of sin is death, but the wages of righteousness is blessings of God. We learned during patriarchal period, from the very beginning of time, that when one fails to be obedient to God's law, God is going to punish him. God gives a law to Adam and Eve. Genesis 3rd chapter, they transgressed that law. What took place? They were cast out of the garden, separated from God. And if you, the 3rd chapter deals with the cursing that God placed upon Adam, Eve, and Satan. Cain in Genesis 4th chapter. He failed to offer a proper offering to God, and thus God rejected his offering. Then he murdered Abel, again bringing God's judgment upon himself. And even Abel or Cain recognized that even with this, that God was placing a mark upon him so that others would not kill him. They recognized the principle that we don't recognize in our nation today, that when someone takes someone's life unjustly, their life should be sacrificed. Capital punishment. The flood, Genesis 6th, 7th, and 8th chapters. That God saw the wickedness of man, that it was great in the earth. Man sinned. What did God do? God destroyed the world. All men except for Noah and his family. The land of Palestine, going to be given to Abraham's descendants. But it would not be till the sin of the Amorites was fulfilled, or was full. Genesis 15 and verse 16. And then they would be destroyed from off the land. Why? Because of sin, iniquity. And the Bible literally is filled from beginning to the end with punishment for sin that is seen and taught to us in relationship to the Gentile world. Paul describes it when he starts in, after giving that theme of the book of Romans in verse 16 and 17 about the gospel. He then in verse 18 says that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. During the patriarchal period we see that. And as Paul continues on in Romans the 1st chapter, he shows that the Gentiles sinned and thus were under the wrath of God. Punishment for sin. But we also learn that when one is obedient to God's law, then God blesses him. Adam and Eve, prior to their sin, it indicates that they continued to have fellowship with God, and God would come in the cool of the day to walk and to talk with them. They would be in the presence of deity. Cain, after his unacceptable offering to God, is told by God, if thou doest well, thou shalt be accepted. There's the principle. You do right, God will bless you. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Why? Because he was obedient to God's will. Genesis 6, verse 8 and verse 22. And thus he was saved from the destruction of the flood. Abraham, told to leave his country and go into a place God would give him. He obeyed. And then through the next several chapters we see Abraham's continued obedience to God. God blesses him. And he is called the friend of God, and then the father of the faithful. Again, numerous illustrations could be seen in the lives of Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and all of those great men of God during that time. But then we would also ask the question, could a Gentile living during that period in which to the Israelites God had given the law of Moses, could a Gentile during that time be right with God? Yes, he could. Well, how? Based upon exactly the same principle that Noah, Abraham, and other great patriarchs during that time prior to the law of Moses were right with God. Their obedience to God's law. And that answers then the aspect of Cornelius, and when he prays to God and God hears him, and we know that God does not hear a sinner, his face is turned from them, God's ears are open unto the righteous. If God's ears are open unto the righteous, then what must Cornelius be at that time? He must have been righteous. And thus God could hear his prayer and answer that prayer, because that which Christ did at the cross had not come into effect for the Gentiles as far as that law. There is a great number of lessons that we can be learned by studying this patriarchal dispensation. We see the need for an atonement, and thus the beginning of the scheme of redemption that was talked about last night. The salvation of man through that one who would bruise the head of Satan, Genesis 3 and verse 15. We see the development of that in Abraham, and you can continue on, and thus the need for obedience to God. And if we obey God, we will be blessed by him. But if we fail to obey him, then we will be punished by God.